Hello, Army. Lights down, volume up, because tonight we're not just talking about friendship. We're cracking open the inner circle of Kim Seokjin, the man who laughs the loudest, carries the oldest young weight, and somehow hides some of the deepest emotional bonds in K-pop. Everyone thinks they know Jin, the worldwide handsome, the dad jokes king, the confident oldest member of BTS. But here's the real question that instantly flips the table. When the cameras are off, schedules are done, and fame fades into the background, who actually stands beside Jin as a real best friend? And wait, why is Jungkook, the member everyone assumes would be at the very top, not even in the top 3? Strange? Shocking? Or does it actually make perfect sense once you look closer? Friendship isn't built on screen time or fan assumptions. It's built in late-night conversations, shared silence, emotional safety, and moments nobody tweets about. Jin is someone who doesn't open up easily. He protects others with humor, deflects pain with laughter, and chooses depth over noise. That means the people closest to him aren't always the ones you expect. Some come from the acting world, some from childhood-like comfort, some from shared emotional wavelengths rather than shared stages. This list isn't about popularity, ships, or viral moments. This is about energy, trust, and history. About who Jin relaxes with, who challenges him, who understands his fears, and who stays when the spotlight disappears. Why does Jin gravitate toward actors so often? What kind of friend does he need at different stages of his life? Who makes him feel seen, not as BTS Jin, but as just Seokjin? And most importantly, are we, as fans, ready to accept that our assumptions might be completely wrong? Because once this countdown starts, you'll realize something powerful. Friendship isn't loud, it's layered. It's not obvious, it's earned. And by the time we reach number 1, you might catch yourself thinking, wait, this actually explains everything. So don't blink. Don't jump ahead. Let the story unfold, one bond at a time. This is Top 7. Who is the best friend of Jin? And trust me, this list is going to mess with what you thought you knew. Number 7. Wendy from Red Velvet sitting at number 7 already tells you this list isn't playing by fan-made rules. This isn't about screen time, ships, or viral chaos. This is about emotional wavelength. Jin and Wendy don't share a loud, constantly visible friendship, but what makes their bond intriguing is how naturally it exists in the background, almost like a soft instrumental track you only notice when it's gone. Both are idols who debuted under massive expectations. Both carry the pressure of being emotional stabilizers in their groups, and both learned early how to smile professionally even when their internal world wasn't calm. Jin's humor often acts as a shield. Wendy's warmth often acts as a buffer, and when those two energies meet, something very human happens. Mutual understanding without explanation. They don't need to overperform friendship. They connect in small moments, shared industry fatigue, and subtle empathy that only someone inside the same pressure cooker can truly grasp. Wendy has spoken many times about valuing sincerity and emotional safety over loud closeness, and Jin, despite his confident exterior, is known among people close to him as someone who chooses comfort over chaos when it comes to real relationships. Their interactions feel calm, grounded, and emotionally intelligent, not the kind that explodes online, but the kind that survives quietly behind the scenes. There's also the unspoken respect factor. Jin respects people who work hard without demanding attention for it, and Wendy is exactly that kind of person. She's disciplined, emotionally open yet controlled, and deeply respectful of boundaries, something Jin values more than fans realize. This is the kind of friendship where conversations don't need jokes every 5 seconds, where silence isn't awkward, and where understanding doesn't require explanation. But here's why she stays at number 7. Their bond, while real and meaningful, exists more as a gentle emotional alignment than a deeply rooted life friendship. They don't share long histories, personal life overlaps, or intense shared experiences outside the industry. Wendy represents a safe emotional reflection, not an everyday anchor. She's someone Jin can relate to, feel understood by, and respect deeply, but not someone embedded into his inner daily emotional orbit. And that's exactly why this placement makes sense. Number 7 isn't weak, it's subtle. It's the reminder that not all meaningful friendships need constant visibility. Some exist simply because two people recognize the same emotional weight in each other and choose kindness over closeness. Number 6. Kwon Hyunbin lands at number 6 not because his bond with Jin is flashy, but because it's built on something far rarer in the entertainment industry: quiet loyalty without performance. Hyunbin, known for his calm presence, athletic discipline, and grounded personality, fits into a category of people Jin naturally gravitates toward when life feels overwhelming. Jin has always been surrounded by noise, cameras, expectations, roles to play, and Hyunbin represents the opposite energy. He's not demanding, not invasive, not trying to extract spotlight from the relationship. That alone already makes him valuable in Jin's world. Their connection feels less like idol-to-idol friendship and more like two men sharing mutual respect for personal space, growth, and self-control. Jin, despite his playful public image, is someone who deeply values emotional maturity. He notices how people handle pressure when no one is clapping, how they behave when things don't go their way. Hyunbin's career path hasn't been easy, and that struggle forged a kind of mental resilience Jin respects deeply. This friendship thrives in environments without cameras, workouts, casual meals, low-energy conversations where no one has to impress anyone. Hyunbin doesn't need Jin to entertain him, and Jin doesn't need Hyunbin to validate him. That balance is powerful. There's also a shared understanding of masculinity here. Not the loud, dominant kind, but the composed, self-disciplined version that doesn't need constant proof. Jin often shoulders responsibility as the eldest, and being around someone like Hyunbin allows him to drop that role completely. No jokes required, no leadership expected, just presence. But why is Hyunbin not higher on the list? Because while the bond is sincere, it's situational rather than deeply historical. Their friendship feels like a safe harbor Jin can return to when he needs grounding, not the core emotional engine that shapes his personal life. Hyunbin is a stabilizer, not a storyteller in Jin's journey. He's someone Jin trusts, respects, and feels calm around, but not someone who has walked with him through the most defining emotional chapters. Number 6 is where solid, dependable friendships live. The kind that don't demand attention, don't fade with time, and don't need explanation. Hyunbin doesn't scream best friend, and that's exactly why Jin keeps him close enough to matter, but far enough to stay peaceful. Number 5, brother not bestie, love without illusion. Jungkook at number 5 is where most people gasp, and that reaction alone proves how misunderstood Jin's emotional world really is. This placement isn't a downgrade, it's a clarification. Jin and Jungkook share one of the deepest bonds in BTS, but depth doesn't always equal best friend energy. What they have is something more complex, more layered, and in many ways heavier than friendship. It's brotherhood shaped by responsibility. From the very beginning, Jin wasn't just a teammate to Jungkook. He was a protector, a buffer, a safe adult presence in a brutal industry. Jungkook grew up under Jin's watch. Jin fed him, teased him, corrected him, defended him, and emotionally shielded him long before Jungkook had the tools to stand on his own. That creates love, loyalty, and unbreakable trust, but it also creates hierarchy. And best friendship, at its core, needs equality. Jin doesn't emotionally lean on Jungkook the way he leans on people closer to his own life stage. He worries about Jungkook more than he confides in him. He laughs for Jungkook more than he vents to him. That's not distance, that's care. Jin is the type who absorbs stress rather than sharing it with those he wants to protect, and Jungkook is permanently in that protected category. Their dynamic is playful, chaotic, affectionate, and deeply sincere, but it's also asymmetrical. Jin gives more emotional shelter than he takes. Jungkook admires Jin, learns from him, and depends on his stability, while Jin quietly carries the responsibility of being the safe place. That's why their relationship shines on screen. It's warm, funny, and emotionally safe for fans to witness. But behind the scenes, it's heavier for Jin. Best friends are where Jin rests emotionally, not where he performs emotional strength. Jungkook represents growth, pride, and family for Jin, not release. There's also timing. Jungkook is still evolving, still experimenting with identity, ambition, and emotional expression, while Jin has already crossed certain internal thresholds. Jin's closest friendships tend to be with people who meet him where he is now, not where he once was as a caretaker. And here's the uncomfortable truth fans rarely want to hear. Jin doesn't want to burden Jungkook with his fears, doubts, or vulnerabilities. He wants Jungkook to fly, not to worry. That decision alone disqualifies Jungkook from the top 3, not because the bond is weak, but because it's too precious to risk emotional dependence. Number 5 is the honest place for Jungkook. Not the loudest, not the flashiest, but one of the most meaningful. This is love without illusion, affection without expectation, and connection without emotional extraction. Jin and Jungkook aren't best friends. They're family by choice and fate. And sometimes that's even stronger, just not lighter. Number 4. Yoo Sung-ho takes number 4 with a vibe that feels almost nostalgic, like opening a door to a version of Jin that rarely shows up on camera anymore. This friendship is fascinating because it's rooted in something Jin deeply craves but rarely admits: the ability to be playful, without performance, and serious, without explanation. Yoo Sung-ho isn't just another actor friend. He's someone who understands early fame, pressure at a young age, and the emotional cost of growing up in the public eye. That shared history creates instant understanding. Jin doesn't have to explain the exhaustion of being on all the time, and Sung-ho doesn't romanticize it either. They meet in the middle, in a space where success doesn't need applause. Their dynamic feels youthful but grounded, teasing, casual, sometimes mischievous, yet underlined by quiet protectiveness. Jin laughs more freely around people who don't expect him to be the mood maker, and Sung-ho is exactly that kind of presence. He doesn't rely on Jin's humor to carry the room, which gives Jin permission to relax, joke when he wants to, and stay silent when he doesn't. There's a subtle but important emotional safety here. Both of them know what it's like to lose parts of normal youth to responsibility, and that shared loss turns into mutual respect rather than bitterness. Jin doesn't need to play the Hyung role too heavily here. Sung-ho is independent, emotionally self-sufficient, and confident in his own skin, which removes pressure from Jin entirely. They can talk about acting, fame, exhaustion, life outside the spotlight, or nothing at all, and it all feels equally valid. But why doesn't this friendship crack the top 3? Because while the emotional wavelength is strong, the integration into Jin's daily emotional core isn't complete. Their bond feels like a refreshing escape rather than a foundational pillar. Sung-ho brings lightness, humor, and relatability, but he isn't someone Jin consistently leans on during internal crossroads. This friendship is a reminder of who Jin was and who he can be when the world slows down, not necessarily who he turns to when everything feels heavy. Number 4 represents balance. Warmth without dependence, fun without chaos, understanding without emotional weight. And sometimes that kind of friendship is exactly what keeps you sane, even if it doesn't sit at the very center of your life. Number 3, Lee Ik-kyung. At number 3 is where this list officially stops being comfortable and starts being honest. This is not a polite friendship. This is not a curated image friendship. This is the kind of bond that exists because two people recognize the same emotional chaos in each other and choose to laugh through it instead of pretending it doesn't exist. Jin and Lee Ik-kyung share a rare frequency, humor that isn't just funny, but defensive, survival-based, and deeply human. Both are known publicly as mood makers, comedians, people who lift the atmosphere wherever they go. But what most people miss is that this kind of humor usually comes from people who learned early how to soften pain by making others laugh. And when two people like that meet, the connection is instant and unfiltered. Around Ik-kyung, Jin doesn't need to maintain the worldwide handsome eldest Hyung balance. He can be ridiculous, sarcastic, self-deprecating, even blunt. Ik-kyung matches that energy without judgment. Their conversations feel fast, messy, loud, and emotionally real, the kind where laughter suddenly drops into silence, then explodes again 5 seconds later. That's not accidental. That's trust. Ik-kyung has been very open about struggle, loss, and emotional hardship in his own life, and Jin is someone who deeply respects people who survive quietly and keep moving forward. There's a mutual recognition here. You've been through things, I don't need the details, but I see you. That kind of understanding creates a bond that doesn't need constant maintenance. They don't have to talk every day to stay close. When they meet, they pick up instantly, same rhythm, same humor, same emotional shorthand. Jin is someone who rarely vents openly, but when he does, it's usually disguised as a joke. Taehyung understands that language perfectly. He knows when to laugh and when to listen without forcing depth. That balance is rare, and it's why this friendship hits top 3 territory. But here's the key reason it doesn't go higher. While the emotional connection is intense, it's not stabilizing. This is a friendship that releases pressure, not one that grounds it. Taehyung and Jin amplify each other's chaotic humor rather than calm each other down. When Jin is exhausted, Taehyung makes him laugh. When Jin is overwhelmed, Taehyung distracts him. That's powerful, but it's not anchoring. Jin still needs people who help him slow down, not just survive faster. Number 3 represents emotional resonance without emotional regulation. It's the friend you run to when you need to forget the weight of the world for a while, when laughter feels like oxygen, when seriousness would be too heavy to carry. Taehyung isn't someone Jin leans on to make big life decisions. He's someone who reminds Jin that he's still human underneath the pressure. And that's why this placement hurts and heals at the same time. Because not all best friendships are soft. Some are loud, messy, and born from shared scars. And sometimes, laughter is the most honest language 2 survivors can share. Number 2, Taehyung at number 2 feels almost illegal to say out loud, not because the bond isn't strong, but because it's too strong to be simplified. Jin and Taehyung don't just share friendship energy, they share emotional ecosystem. Their connection isn't linear, calm, or predictable. It's chaotic, tender, confusing, playful, deeply affectionate, and at times emotionally raw. This is the kind of bond that looks unserious on the surface, but carries surprising depth underneath. Taehyung is one of the very few people Jin allows to cross emotional boundaries without explanation. He can be strange, dramatic, clingy, silent, impulsive, or painfully honest, and Jin doesn't shut him down. Instead, Jin adapts. That alone says everything. Jin is usually the emotional regulator in any room. With Taehyung, he lets go of that role. Their humor feels childlike, their teasing feels intimate, and their silences feel comfortable rather than awkward. Taehyung isn't afraid of Jin's seriousness, and Jin isn't afraid of Taehyung's emotional unpredictability. That mutual acceptance creates a space where both of them can exist without editing themselves. Taehyung challenges Jin emotionally in ways no one else does. He asks strange questions, makes unexpected observations, and forces Jin to step out of logic and into feeling. Jin, in return, grounds Taehyung when his emotions spiral too freely. This push-and-pull dynamic is powerful. It's creative, inspiring, and deeply bonding. They don't just make each other laugh, they make each other feel. And that's dangerous territory for Jin, who usually prefers emotional control. Taehyung bypasses Jin's defenses effortlessly. He doesn't knock, he walks right in. But here's the reason Taehyung stops at number 2. Emotional intensity doesn't always equal emotional stability. This friendship is deep, but it's also volatile. Taehyung absorbs emotions like a sponge, and Jin, as someone who already carries responsibility, sometimes ends up managing emotional waves instead of resting. Jin can be himself with Taehyung, yes, but he's also still protecting, guiding, and steadying him. That subtle responsibility never fully disappears. Best friends, for Jin, are where he feels emotionally unburdened. With Taehyung, the bond is profound, affectionate, and irreplaceable, but it still requires energy. This is a soul connection, not a sanctuary. It's laughter mixed with confusion, affection mixed with concern, freedom mixed with responsibility. Taehyung is someone Jin would go to battle with, not necessarily someone he retreats with. Number 2 represents emotional closeness without emotional rest. A bond that shapes you, moves you, inspires you, but doesn't always let you breathe. And that's why it sits right here, just one step away from the top. Because the strongest connections aren't always the safest ones. And Jin, more than anyone, knows the difference. Number 1. Lee Sang-yeob, emotional shelter, home without performance. Lee Sang-yeob stands at number 1 not because he's the loudest presence in Jin's life, but because he is the quiet place Jin can finally put everything down. This is the friendship that explains all the previous rankings. This is where Jin doesn't need to joke, doesn't need to protect, doesn't need to regulate emotions, and most importantly, doesn't need to be BTS Jin. With Sang-yeob, Jin is just Seokjin, imperfect, thoughtful, sometimes tired, sometimes unsure, and fully allowed to exist without editing himself. Their bond feels less like friendship and more like emotional resonance. It's steady, adult, and deeply grounding. Sang-yeob is someone who listens more than he speaks, who understands emotional nuance without demanding vulnerability, and who never rushes Jin into explaining himself. That matters because Jin is someone who processes emotions internally and slowly. He doesn't open up through dramatic confession, he opens up through presence. And Sang-yeob is exceptional at providing exactly that. Their conversations don't need punchlines. Silence doesn't feel heavy. Time doesn't feel urgent. This is the kind of friendship built on long meals, calm voices, shared fatigue, and mutual respect for boundaries. Sang-yeob has lived through career ups and downs, public expectations, and personal introspection without letting it harden him. Jin sees that resilience and trusts it. He knows Sang-yeob won't panic at honesty, won't dramatize vulnerability, and won't use emotional access as leverage. That level of psychological safety is rare, especially for someone as globally visible as Jin. With Sang-yeob, Jin doesn't have to be strong for someone. He doesn't have to shield, guide, or entertain. He can admit confusion. He can be quiet without being asked what's wrong. He can rest emotionally, not just physically. And that's the defining difference. Every other friendship on this list offers something valuable: laughter, chaos, reflection, inspiration, grounding. But Sang-yeob offers rest. He doesn't pull energy from Jin, he stabilizes it. He doesn't amplify Jin's personality, he softens it. He doesn't need Jin to perform happiness to validate the bond. He accepts Jin's emotional weather exactly as it is. That's why Jungkook doesn't outrank him. That's why Taehyung doesn't take the top spot. Because best friendship, at its core, isn't about intensity or affection. It's about safety. Sang-yeob is where Jin feels emotionally unobserved, unjudged, and unburdened. He's the friend Jin could disappear with for a while and come back feeling human again. Number 1 isn't dramatic. It's not flashy. It doesn't trend, but it lasts. And in a life built under constant spotlight, the greatest luxury Jin can have is a friendship that feels like home. And that's exactly what Lee Sang-yeob is. Lee Sang-yeob isn't just the person Jin leans on. He's the person Jin doesn't have to lean around. That difference is subtle, but it's everything. Around Sang-yeob, Jin's shoulders drop naturally. His voice slows. His humor becomes optional instead of automatic. This friendship exists outside the hierarchy Jin lives in every day, not as the eldest Hyung, not as the global idol, not as the emotional pillar for others. Sang-yeob doesn't come to Jin for strength, guidance, or reassurance. He comes as an equal, and Jin, for once, doesn't have to calculate how much of himself to give. That's why this bond feels adult in the deepest sense, not boring, not distant, but emotionally self-sufficient. They don't consume each other, they coexist. Sang-yeob understands that some days Jin wants to talk about nothing meaningful at all, and some days he wants to talk about everything without being interrupted. And Sang-yeob adjusts without being asked. That kind of emotional intuition can't be trained. It's earned through time, shared values, and mutual respect. Jin trusts him not just with jokes or surface thoughts, but with uncertainty, with the parts of himself that don't know what comes next. In a life built on schedules, goals, and constant forward motion, Sang-yeob is where Jin is allowed to pause without guilt. No pressure to be inspirational. No pressure to be funny. No pressure to be strong. Just present. And that's the final truth this list leads to. Jin's best friend isn't the one who shines brightest beside him, but the one who makes the spotlight feel unnecessary. Lee Sang-yeob doesn't complete Jin's image. He protects Jin's inner life. And when everything else fades, the noise, the expectations, the roles, that's the friendship that remains standing.